Now that we've covered all the species in 2 parts, it's time to move on to 3 parts. We'll discuss 3-part counterpoint in 2 lessons. In this one, we'll extend the same 5 species we already covered in 2 parts, but now with an added 3rd part in whole notes. In the next lesson, we'll cover some less known variations of species counterpoint, which however prove very useful in real-life situations. In classical species counterpoint, the student does 3 and 4-part exercises, where one of the parts is in species 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Another part is the cantus, and there's also a 3rd part, and eventually a 4th part for 4-part counterpoint, composed by the student, which is also in whole notes. In other words, a second for a species part. This brings up the question of auditory priorities. It's impossible to pay equal attention to many things going on at the same time, so the composer needs to know where the focus will be at any given moment. In the case of first species, since all the 3 parts will now be in whole notes, the lines which are easiest to hear are, in order of priority, the top part, the bottom part, and the middle part. In the case of the other species, the part which is moving will normally attract more attention than the ones which are staying in whole notes only. As for the whole note parts, those in the other parts are always the easiest to hear. This is a very important point. Evolution has designed us so that perception has priorities. We don't want to get caught singing in the woods and not notice the hungry lion coming down the path. Since these priorities are a fact of human hearing, music has to take them into consideration. While it's desirable to ensure that each singer or instrumentalist in a contrapuntal texture has a reasonably interesting line, there's always one or the other which is most prominent at any given moment. In species counterpoint, this is not a problem, since, as we said, the most active line will jump out at the listener. But we get into more complex textures, starting in the next lesson. The composer's intentions will have to stay realistic if the result is to be audibly successful. We'll come back to this point more than once. There is one change to the harmonic limitations of species counterpoint. In addition to symbol triads, the student can now use dominant 7th chords, provided that the lines remain easy to sing and provided the 7th is correctly resolved. This is a little different from classical species pedagogy, but behind this decision lies a fundamental fact not always sufficiently appreciated. Harmony and counterpoint are not separate disciplines. You don't have one brain for harmony and another for counterpoint. The more you go on with counterpoint, the more you need rich harmony, and the more you go on with harmony, the more you need interesting voice leading. So at the end of your studies of harmony and counterpoint, the 2 have to come together. Using dominant 7ths is our first step in this direction. Now an example of each species in 3 parts. Here's the first species example for bass, alto, and soprano. The cantus is in the alto. Notice that all 3 lines are well placed in their respective vocal ranges, and they all have different peaks and curves. The dominant 7th in measure 7 is correctly resolved in measure 8. Notice also that just because there are 3 parts does not mean that all the chords must be complete. In fact, measures 1, 3, 4, 5, 7, and 8 have incomplete chords. As long as there is a 3rd or a 6th present, the sound remains rich. Here's a second species example for the same 3 voices. The cantus, again, is in the alto part. Again, not all the chords are complete, but the overall sonority remains rich. As before, the lines peak in different places. Note the modal ending, the G natural before the final tonic. Modes often provide interesting alternatives for our lines. Now a third species example. Here the cantus is in the soprano. Here again, some chords are incomplete, measures 1, 3, and 5, but the sound is rich nonetheless. Each line has an independent curve. Although the third species voice is in the middle, it stands out so much because it's much more active than the others. Note that the direct octave between measure 2 and measure 3, bass and tenor parts, is really not audible at all. When direct octaves and fifths are not in the outer parts, they don't pose a problem. In fact, even the direct fifth in the outer parts between measure 7 and 8 here is less disturbing than it would be in two parts. Just the middle part adds the third of the chord, making the overall sound richer. As we saw in our discussion of parallels when we looked at third species, these situations require careful listening and thoughtful judgment rather than blind adherence to rigid rules. Fourth species in three parts poses no special problems. In fact, the 9/8 suspension, which is bare in two parts, can now be used, since the third part can supply the missing third or sixth of the chord. Notice that the first bar in the four species line starts on A flat, which is not part of the tonic chord. Since the beginning of a piece should create a bit of suspense, this isn't a problem. Of course, the final cadence must be a root position tonic triad to create convincing punctuation. Finally, a fifth species example. Notice the 4-2 chord in measure 2. The seventh, A, in the bass is resolved correctly to G sharp in the next bar. The melody here might seem at first almost like two separate phrases, one low from measure 1 and one high starting on the second beat of measure 5, but the leap back down in measure 7 ties the whole together. It's worth comparing these counterpoint exercises to typical tonal harmony exercises. The most important difference is there are many more incomplete chords here. Rather than including all three notes of the triad, one of them can be doubled instead. This allows for much greater flexibility in organizing the melodic lines. Also, the harmonic progression is not always as strongly directed as in basic tonal harmony. This also allows for more freedom in the choice of melodic tones. Of course, there are moments where the composer may want to affirm the tonality very strongly, and in those cases, strong harmonic direction is needed. But otherwise, the fact that some of the counterpoints have a slightly modal feel is an advantage, not a problem. In fact, it's interesting to note that Bach's late counterpoint becomes a lot more modal overall. Later on, we will also explore chromatic counterpoint, which opens up yet more harmonic and tonal possibilities. So what is the best way to proceed with three-part species counterpoint? Once you've decided which voices you'll use and where to place the cantus, the best method is to write 3 or 4 bars of the species line, then try to fill in the remaining line in whole notes. Continue like this, a few bars at a time, till the end. This is because if you write the rhythmically active line from start to finish by itself, you risk having to redo the whole thing if you run into problems with the third part. Working a few bars at a time leaves more room for changes as you go along. Notice that I said write 3-4 bars of the species line. Do not proceed 1 bar at a time. That makes it very difficult to get a feel for the lines as a whole. A note about first species in 3 parts. Since all the parts are in whole notes, write 3 or 4 bars of the outer parts first, since they're the most salient ones. Your priority should always be what's easiest to hear. Remember, work on 3 to 4 bars at a time. Ensure the dominant sevenths are easy to sing and properly resolved. You'll need a lot of practice to get comfortable with each species. Since you're trying to make friends with the notes, you need to spend a lot of time with them. 15 exercises per species is a reasonable amount. Sing and play. I repeat this at the end of every lesson because it's so essential to really interiorizing these skills. You can passively listen to your computer play back any number of lines at once, but you won't really get a feel for writing singing lines unless you sing each part yourself. This way you combine ear training and counterpoint, which is the most sensible way to learn them both.